So the temperature today is balmy. I don't know if you can see that. A balmy negative 34 degrees. And when you add in the wind chill, it feels like negative 45 outside. So just a fine, beautiful Canadian day. But I was reflecting on a post that my friend Joan Tollefson had posted on her Facebook earlier today or sometime last night. And in it, she's sort of reflecting on the upcoming end of the year and falling away of some of her spiritual illusions, especially around the spiritual industry, which, you know, in her own words, is a term that never really sat well with her because she never really saw it in those terms. She always thought it was somewhat of a cynical term to use, but now, after years and years of reading books and awakening stories and stories of transcendence and enlightenment and people claiming to have lost their sense of self, over and over again in different forms and different publications, the weight and the gravity of all of that is settling on her in a way that she's beginning to see how it has turned into an industry. It's a very sobering realization to come to, and I reflect back now on that period of my life. It wasn't all that long ago when I came to a similar realization myself. There's a deep resistance within us to want to see that, because it robs us of something extremely vital, and that is a sense of belonging to something greater than ourselves. And the spiritual industry for me, back when I didn't actually see it as an industry, back when I was very much in the midst of it, reading the books, reading up the teachers and following their teachings, never directly and never really, signing up with any one teacher, but following them from afar, sampling the spiritual marketplace, studying the old texts. There was always a sense of purpose, of progress, of every time something resonated deeply with me, a sense of something new opening up within me. There was always this sense of progressing along to somewhere, along some kind of path. And spiritual culture provided the terrain, the context for that path. Right? It was the stage on which this narrative of my spiritual journey was unfolding. To see that stage as a construct itself, to see that whole thing was just kind of a production of a kind, a theatrical platform on which to act out my fictional narratives, my stories, was not something I wanted to see, not something I'd ever hoped to see. Because it almost erased the relevance of the past 20 odd years of my life. I had heavily invested my sense of identity in that narrative, because no other narrative had ever fit in my life. the whole social narrative, the narrative of finding a job, of being this person on this path, to a path that other people around me, my family and friends, could recognize and endorse. None of that really ever fit me. And so the spiritual impulse early on towards metaphysics, towards esoteric wisdom, and all of that, to self-knowledge, self-realization, was this kind of avant-garde, go my own way, rebellious narrative that really somehow fit me. It felt like it fit me. At the very least, it gave me an alternate narrative to the social narrative. I could still explain myself to others by saying, oh, I'm a truth seeker. I'm seeking enlightenment. At least that's language that, even if they didn't get that world, they still understood what it kind of meant. Especially in India, growing up, they were like, oh, Shiv is going down that spiritual path, and he's going to struggle all his life materially. And I would hear my family whispering about that. I wish he hadn't been oriented in this way, and so they were worried about it. But they understood. They understood the hazards and the pitfalls of me becoming some ascetic and then going out into the forest or joining some group of sadhus and meditating in a cave. They still understood what that narrative looked like, even though it was an unfamiliar narrative to them. The spiritual narrative is still a social narrative, even if it is a fringe social narrative. And so I kind of wore that as my identity for many, many, many years. But to see that as a construct itself, to realize that all those teachings and those years of scriptures, those schools of thought, those ascetic lineages, those spiritual disciplines, the monasteries, the monks, the robes, the doctrines, the mantras, the meditative techniques, that all of that was, in a sense, no different than any other cultural construct that we have. It's no different than red light means stop, green light means go. It's a made-up rule that has no intrinsic truth to it. It only has a social truth to it. Similarly, this was the case with the vast majority of spiritual culture. Now, I don't want to dismiss absolutely all of it as falsehood, because clearly many of the insights that have emerged from people themselves are meaningful insights. So when you reflect on the original teachings of Jesus, there was no construct of Christianity at the time. There's just this guy, allegedly, this guy reflecting on some very, very deep spiritual, mystical, and existential experiences, and having some deep recognitions and realizations of his own existence, and speaking about it in a way that the layman of that time and that culture would understand. But then you take the people who were immediately around him, who are obviously impacted deeply by those teachings and those principles, and they then Those are the apostles. And they then, through some process of osmosis, come to some version of that realization within themselves, but not that same degree of realization, because they haven't necessarily gone through the process themselves. They are now listening to the second-hand information. And then from those apostles, it is then passed down to the general crowd, who now interprets it as third-hand information. And then from those crowds, it passes down through word of mouth, through generations, until it's finally captured and scribed as the Bible. And this is now not just third or fourth hand information, it's 100th hand information. And people find this Bible get passed down through the ages, and people read the words and they find resonance with it, because somewhere deep down inside, yes, there is something that recognizes there's a truth buried deep within it. But that's not the same as seeing that truth for oneself. And so what ends up happening in the lieu of direct experience, in borrowed second-hand experience, is that because that experience does not emerge from within, that experience is influencing from without, from outside us, the influence of that needs to be sustained. Okay? It's kind of like, to come up with an analogy, it's kind of like having a well in your backyard where you can draw water from at any time you're thirsty, as opposed to a well being in somebody else's backyard, or far away in a river, or there being a river far away, and you having to trek every day to go and replenish that water and come back. And that is essentially what ends up happening, is that in lieu of direct experience, in the absence of direct experience, people then need to constantly replenish their perspective, constantly replenish their resonance to what sounds true, because they do not have access to what is true. And so they keep returning to these texts. And in order to make that process of returning to it more reliable, they start building structures and frameworks and processes in place that will help facilitate that constant return back to that. And that structure, that framework, those processes are the rituals, the beliefs, the communities, the practices, all of that. All those are designed to keep bringing you back, not to the truth, but to the version of the truth that you are familiar with, that you have been told, that resonates with you, that brings out that feeling of resonance from within you. And that's a huge difference here, because you're not accessing the truth. You are now borrowing a version of the truth. And so what we call the spiritual industry is essentially the normalization of that pattern and that behavior to go and borrow the truth. It's like now you don't have to hike all the way to the distant river. There's a taxi service, there's an Uber, there's a procession of people that you can even hire to go and get that water for you. There's an entire system and infrastructure in place to get you going all the way to that river to borrow that water. And so what is your impetus then to ever dig your own well? If all that is already set up for you, if now you're not even inconvenienced anymore by that long trek that you have to make in order to go and find that river from which you can now borrow some truth or wisdom, and you have this entire infrastructure in place to do it for you seamlessly and conveniently, then what impetus can there ever be for you to try and discover the truth from within your own direct experience? Very little. The more constraints, the more limitations you remove from a person's life, the fewer catalysts that can motivate that person to move in a new direction. You keep them safely cocooned. And that's what spiritual culture has become. There are now so many portals of access to that same regurgitated wisdom. Okay? New Age is essentially now an entire religion of itself. It just has no centralized kind of authority to it. And in that sense, it differs from Christianity. But for all practical purposes, New Age spirituality, the industry of it, is the new religion. And it has various, different variations, different subsects and denominations. There's a spattering of Zen and a smattering of non-duality and a little bit of mindfulness, adding some Taoism and some Kundalini and all of that. And then you've got this nice little hybrid that can be repackaged a million different ways, but it's the same thing being said over and over again. And now, because you can access it on your phone, on your laptop, on your tablet, you can go to a retreat, you can go to an intensive, you can go to a Zoom meeting, you can read a book, you can listen to an audio tape, you can listen to a podcast, you can watch a video, you can watch a movie, you can watch a TV series. No longer do you have to save money for years to get on a plane to India and then go suffer through diarrhea and food poisoning for days before you find that one little apartment hidden in some slum of Mumbai where some guy you've heard of who has deeply connected with the truth will allow you to enter his little apartment and talk to you for a few hours of your life. And so when the whole weight of what we have created in terms of culture is truly seen as a system of arbitrary rules, laws, rituals, processes, all designed to give us a sense of a feeling of artificial purpose, artificial safety, artificial security, artificial meaning, and artificial progress, and eventually artificial truth, it can be tremendously deflating. And the only response a person could have is one of despair when they see this. And if they aren't naturally resilient, they may never recover from that kind of despair, because we are programmed to seek comfort in some kind of paradigm or system, but to be robbed of every kind of paradigm and to be left naked just as a physical body in this world of earth, fire, wind, water, and nature, and nothing else, is tremendously alien to us. And so it takes a very, very long period of reorientation and constantly coming to that acceptance that this, literally this, is it. And not this is it in a spiritual sense, but this is it in an absolutely literal sense. Just let that land for you for a second. This is it. Negative 34 degrees, snow on the roads, absolutely freezing, having a conversation with my phone. This is it. And very ironically and surprisingly, when you actually fully accept this as being the reality, then all other constructs gradually begin to fall by the wayside, including the construct of the self. Because the construct of the self is related to some kind of social paradigm, the spiritual paradigm being one kind of social paradigm, as I mentioned. And if there's just no social paradigm to relate to, then there's no self-construct that can actually hold up, because it's like a character without a story to participate in. There's no point of that character existing anymore. There's no relevance. It might have some utility in going through the motions of other people's social perception of you and having to continue to participate in their stories, the story of that my company has of me as an employee, the story that my family has of me, so on and so forth. But within one's own experience, within one's own life, there's no story anymore to participate in. There's no paradigm within which that story can even happen. And so the character itself falls to pieces. And in that process, who you truly are emerges to the forefront.